Hello, I'm Gina Chavez here at the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and today I'm sitting here with our CEO, Ann Beeson, and our Legislative and Policy Director, Luis Figueroa. We are going to dive into the nuts and bolts of what just happened during the 86th legislative session here in Texas. These are 140 days that really affect the lives of Texans for years to come, and so we want to understand what really just happened. So we're going to start with the high-level successes of the session.
Well, the high point really was that we had a session focused on issues that really matter to Texans. It wasn't like the last legislative session where there was a lot of focus on controversial issues that don't really matter to a lot of people. And I would say the big highlights were definitely a major bill to advance school finance reform, to make sure that every single Texas student has the resources that they need to get a quality education from our public schools in Texas. We also had a big win to protect consumers against surprise medical bills, and really ultimately, you know, the session kind of really came down to tax policy, right, and what the balance should be between really adequately funding our schools and pushing what a lot of leaders were pushing for, which was tax cuts, which unfortunately cut into the resources that we needed to support other public services.
Absolutely, and I think one thing to do is put this a little bit in historical context, where we were coming from the previous session. So last session, we were stuck in a lot of controversial issues. We were talking about vouchers, which CPPP led the fight against and did a lot of great work on opposing vouchers. There was a lot of discussion about things like bathroom bills and other things that were not necessarily priorities of the state and were not advancing the issues for hardworking Texans. And so I think one of the things we should be proud of is how we've changed the conversation a little bit. There was a real realization for the first time that money matters in education, and a realization that the state needs to put a bigger share into it. And I think at the end of the day, when they talk about what is the legacy of the session, I think that'll come out.
Now, were there some things, it was good that we avoided the controversies this year as much as possible, but were there some things that do matter to Texans that the legislature was silent on?
Absolutely. I think the big disappointment of this session, which I think will be the other legacy of the session, is the failure to address health coverage for Texans. We had real opportunities this session to maybe not pass Medicaid expansion, which we really appreciate the legislators that led that fight for Medicaid expansion, and there were votes on that in committee hearings, but there were real opportunities to address health coverage for children, for mothers who recently had children, and the bills that passed the House, but unfortunately were not priorities in the Senate. And I believe that that is going to be the ultimate disappointment of this session, to not address health care coverage in any meaningful way this session.
That's right, and I just want to put a pin in that and say, look, we have got in Texas the very highest number and the highest rate of uninsured people in the country. That should be completely unacceptable for Texans, and as Luis said, it's really got to be a top priority for lawmakers coming up, and we'll be working very hard behind the scenes to make sure that that's the case. I'll kick us off and really just say a little bit more about our 9-year struggle to protect consumers from surprise medical bills. This is research that really CPPP led the way, not just in Texas but nationally, in putting out data that showed that too many Texans were really having major challenges with their family budget because they were going to emergency rooms in hospitals that were in their network and then being stuck with these surprise medical bills because the providers inside those ERs and in those hospitals were not in network. And we worked for a number of years to advance some kind of temporary fixes, but really our goal all along was to keep consumers safe from getting these terrible bills. And finally, after much work and all of the data and the fabulous stories about Texans that were that we were able to get out there, you know, in terms of what the experiences they were having, we were actually able to get a great bill, and maybe Luis, you can say a little bit more about just the details of the fix and what that means.
No, absolutely. We're super excited that we were able to pass this legislation after a 9-year struggle. There is no question that this didn't just happen. It took a lot of hard work. in the legislative process. It was, I think, one of the things I'm most proud of about is that it was bipartisan. There were a number of legislators who took this on at the beginning of legislature, and instead of everyone saying it has to be my way or the highway, they eventually came together and worked out the bills with all the stakeholders, including the hospitals and the doctors and the consumers, with the consumer groups really being the guiding principle of, at the end of the day, we got to take the patients out of this, because this is becoming too big of a financial strain for these families to get the surprise medical bill. And that was the ultimate goal at the beginning, but it took a lot of negotiations to get there. So I'm very happy and supportive of the work that the entire legislature and our team did to make sure that the policy was right at the end.
And just to show that Texas policy really matters nationally, the work that we have done here has helped to really build momentum now for a federal fix, and that would help protect consumers all over the country. So we really hope that happens, and we'll keep supporting it behind the scenes as we've been doing.
Absolutely.
Are there any other things that we can talk about that, you know, Texans might be proud of? I know there was some movement with, you know, paid sick time, maybe some movement with the high school equivalency exam bill. Can we talk about that like this?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the proactive side, one thing that didn't get a lot of attention this year was our work on higher ed. You know, school finance and some of the other issues took a lot of the media attention, but we had some really big wins for higher education this session. One is an issue to address the burdensome of student loans. Previously, prior to this session, if you defaulted on a loan, you could have your occupational license taken away from you for defaulting on your student loan, which makes no sense, right? Because there's no way you'll be able to pay back that loan if they take away your ability to work. So that was an issue that was addressed this session. They can no longer take away your occupational license. And another one that did not get a lot of attention is the students who perform well on high school equivalency exams. And they will now be, if they get a high score on that, as determined by the coordinating board, they will be deemed college ready. And so in this case, many families and many parents who are taking these exams won't have to prepare for a second exam that covers the same material, and they'll be able to be deemed college ready by performing well on the high school equivalency exam. So that was some exciting news for sure. On the defensive side, we had a lot of work to do this session. You know, even though we talk a lot about how there was a lot of bipartisanship and a lot of good things that happened this session, there were also a lot of bad bills that were introduced this session that CPPP had to do a lot of work on. One of the ones that garnered a lot of attention which was an attack on local democracy's ability to set their own priorities, particularly on the issue of workers. There was an omnibus bill that would have taken away the ability of cities to be able to provide paid sick leave, to be able to provide for all sorts of worker protections. And that bill eventually, because of the work of a large coalition, was divided into 4 bills and ultimately was ultimately defeated in the House. And that was an effort that was not just about inside policy, but about the rising voices of workers across Texas who really showed the legislators that this is, you know, it's time we got to do better for workers. And we really appreciate all the great work of our coalition on that one.
Right. Well, we have to talk about the bad news. And you know, a lot of, just like you mentioned, Luis, a lot of what we do here at the center is we not only fight for good bills, we also have to block bad bills, but sometimes things do get through. And so let's talk about that bad news a little bit.
So every 10 years, as you know, the Constitution says that we have to count every single person in the United States, and a lot of other states really support the efforts of the federal government to ensure a complete count by passing legislation or through, you know, executive order by their governors, creating committees that actually help support the count. And so CPPP and lots of other partners tried to get the Texas legislature to pass that kind of a bill to create a complete count committee in Texas. And unfortunately, it didn't get anywhere. And you would think it would be completely uncontroversial, but unfortunately, we now know that the census has been politicized, and that should really have never happened because, again, it's a requirement in the Constitution. It's critical to have a complete count for three primary reasons. Number one, because it determines whether Texans get the representation we deserve in Congress. It's what determines how many seats we get. And two, because it determines how much federal funding will come to Texas. And this is money that we've already paid into the system. The Texas taxpayers have paid into the system. And so if we're not counted adequately, we won't actually get the amount of funds for critical programs on education, healthcare, housing, schools, food stamps, so many different programs that Texans rely on. The census helps determine what we're going to get. And then finally, businesses rely on the census all the time, to figure out where they're going to build the next grocery store, for example. And so, unfortunately, the bill didn't go anywhere. We are working with many partners to try to unofficially organize community groups and leaders around a complete census count, and we'll keep fighting. But unfortunately, we didn't get much momentum at all in the legislature.
And unfortunately, this is now going to fall on the cities and counties to have to do a lot of work on this, right? And so at the same time, another disappointment that we had this session, Senate Bill 2, which was, as we know, a legislative priority for the leadership, is preventing cities and counties from being able to set their own tax rate. And so if they go above 3.5%, they will have to get a tax ratification election, or they'll have to send it to the voters in order to increase the revenue above that amount. So as the state is putting more burdens on cities and counties and to address the needs, whether it's libraries, whether it's fire departments, police departments, libraries, or things like the census, they are unable to raise the revenue that they're going to need for a lot of those services. So that was another disappointment this session. I think we'll see how that plays out over the next few sessions and how cities and counties are able to address that. But I think that was one of the disappointments of this session for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and then of course we have to talk about where we go from here. Obviously, another session doesn't happen for another couple years. What are we doing in the meantime, and what should we look forward to in 2021?
One idea that should be taken off the table is the idea of a sales tax swap. This was an idea that came in the middle of the session. It came out a little bit of left field. Nobody really knew, where it came from, but the leadership was pushing it hard. But thankfully, there was a coalition of both people from the conservative side and from the progressive side that said this is not a good idea. 80% of Texans were going to be hurt from a sales tax swap, and thankfully, our experts here at CPPP were able to draw attention to that early on. It was confirmed by the Legislative Budget Board, and we were able to stop that process. But I think going forward, I think that's an idea that isn't the way to go forward to find revenue. Finding revenue doesn't mean placing the burden on our low-income and middle-class Texans. Finding revenue means coming in from an equitable standpoint for all Texans pay their fair share. And I think we'll see some of that in this upcoming session. Things like cutting the yachts tax, which was this crazy idea that somehow we need to give a tax break to people who own yachts. This is not sensible, common sense solutions to find revenue. So we're going to have to raise the volume on that, so to speak, at CPPP and our coalition, our allies, to say we need to find real revenue ideas, and we have the ideas ready to go. We just need some more legislators and some more people to really consider some of these ideas that will be long-term, viable, equitable solutions for Texas.
We were just so excited to have the opportunity to work with so many partners across the ideological spectrum. I mean, from local leaders who really understand, what our communities need to thrive, to all of the organizational partners with the fight to protect consumers against surprise medical bills, and all of the wonderful partners, that helped us prove how important it was to pass school finance reform and ensure strong public schools for the future generations. So, really just wanted to take a minute to thank our partners and everyone, all the great staff at CPPP who helped us achieve these wins with our friends.
Well, and thank you so much for following along with our legislative work. For the session may be over, but our work is never done here at the center. And you can follow along with our work on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all the good places. So come find us and stay tuned for more data analysis, as well as what you can do to make sure that we are creating a Texas that is a place for all Texans to be healthy, well-educated, and financially secure. Thanks so much for tuning in.